This is like take 8 here in my home office. My name is Patrick Whitehead. I'm a college professor, specifically professor of psychology, and I've been asked to teach a graduate seminar for teachers, middle grades, elementary, high school, and in some cases, administration, I believe. I also do workshops for college faculty interested in developing a research program, and I mentor undergraduate researchers and am designing a uh, college student research or writing seminar or symposium or something like that. But this is going to be the first in a series of brief talks about how and why to do classroom research. It's designed for teachers, but I suspect it would also be useful for college faculty who are interested in developing research program. And one of my arguments I've had for maybe 8 years or so is that for college faculty who want to develop a research program but don't have the time, or maybe are um, maybe they lack the confidence to do it, beginning with what they're already experienced with, such as organizing their classroom, developing a lesson plan, assessing student achievement of learning outcomes. In other words, classroom research is a great way to get started. And so you can develop a classroom research uh, plan that is rigorous enough to publish as peer-reviewed research. But you don't have to go that far in order to benefit from classroom research. So in this first intro video, I just want to talk about why it's important to engage, or for teachers to engage in research. Again, I'm talking specifically to K through 12, I guess pre-K through 12 teachers, but I think this also applies to college professors. So, why should you bother with classroom research? I suspect that if you're a teacher, you're already engaged in the research process, whether or not you recognize it as such. So, conducting research isn't like completely stepping outside of your role as teacher or as educator. It's part of your role already. So, you're choosing in some cases curricula, sometimes curricula, or maybe most oftentimes curricula is given to you, but how you present that to students, what sort of activities you do, how you give feedback, whether students work together uh, as individuals or you work as a class, how frequently you take breaks, um, whether you have like a disciplinary strategy. When you first start as a teacher, you're worried about all of these things. You're not sure how to do it right. Maybe you're making choices based on your own experiences as a kid or what you feel like ought to work, what you've read about should work, and so on. But you begin to implement these practices for the best of intentions, and then whether you collect data or not, or formally collect data or not, you change your decisions based on how your classes went. So maybe you have a particularly difficult student, and at first you try to like discipline them and it doesn't work, it gets worse, and then other students start to get involved, and then you're like, I don't know what to do, and you kind of do something crazy, or you talk to a colleague and they give you a suggestion, you try it and it works. Well, now you've just added to your toolbox a skill for classroom management in this example. Or maybe you're teaching kids a new language, or their numbers or algebra or whatever the topic might be, and you learn through experience what works and what doesn't. And that's why by year 10, you've developed a whole skill set, and you pretty much start feeling like an expert in some cases. And so you can mentor some of your younger colleagues or some of the newer teachers in your program. So what I'm trying to say is you're already doing the fundamental project of classroom research. All that changes with the formal research process is you're more careful about manipulating the conditions in your classroom. So if you try a new disciplinary technique, you write it down. You say, okay, here's the problem I'm experiencing. Here's what I think is going to work, or here's what hasn't worked. Here's what I've read about, and then here's what I'm going to try and what I think is going to happen. That way, when you've done it all, you've got a record and you're less likely to misremember the details or imagine the details were different than they are. I'm always shocked in my own experience how much I miss when I just reflect on something and kind of come up with an explanation or a narrative for what happened. And that goes with what happens in my classroom, but also with what happens in my formal research program and then in my own life, like as an athlete and as a writer. When I keep records, I can start to recognize patterns. And so, why should you engage in research as a teacher? Well, I'll get to some of those details that are outlined in this talk, but well, I guess we'll just start there. I've got it organized after all. So, um, man, research really doesn't sound like fun, but my argument is that it is fun. Huh. Now I'm trying to think of why I wrote this because, as I've just described it kind of sounds like a chore. I enjoy crunching numbers. I enjoy the analytic process. And so for me, it's quite a bit of fun. I like, I don't simply like that something works. I want to know why it works and how it worked. So I like to be able to see the actual transformation occur. When I collect data, so for example, this last semester I taught a research methods course and I had students try to apply the scientific method to social science questions. And at the very beginning of the semester, students were unsure of how to proceed. They were confused. They thought that common sense is what they could rely on. And so they could just kind of come up with a clever response relying on common sense. And throughout the semester, I trained them to apply the principles of scientific reasoning to that process and sort of let go of common sense. And a switch flipped at some point in most of the students so that by the end, they were way more skilled at it. But I collected data the whole time so I could reflect on the change as it occurred. And it was like a slow incremental process throughout the semester, starting from this low inability to apply scientific reasoning to later, where they were doing it skillfully. Um, and each time I collected a new data set, which was just an exam, and so the exam was based on my learning objectives, and so it was kind of cleverly designed that way. So each time I got an exam, I could take the average score and get a sense of how the needle was moving. And it started off, the class average was like a 74%, then it was an 86%, and then it was an 88%. And so it was a clear upward trend. Um, and I loved actually grading the exams because I was collecting data to see how it was working. I had a sense that it was working. It felt like it was working, but I wasn't sure if I had just started giving answers and students had just learned kind of how to manipulate me with their answers. But I had objective evidence. Um, and I really liked that process. I also like thinking about the mechanics of a classroom, what works and how to solve problems, and also understanding more deeply why certain problems occur in the first place. So that whole process of thinking through what's bothering me and articulating what that means, it's a introspective process, and I enjoy that too. I also enjoy reading about things that matter to me. So every single aspect of that um, makes me rather, every aspect of that is something that I genuinely enjoy for intrinsic reasons. So I guess it seems a little bit disingenuous to just call it like it's a blanket statement fun. But as you can see, there are aspects of the process that I really love. So maybe a different way of saying this now, and this is me criticizing the earlier version of me who wrote this slide. A different way of saying this might be find aspects of the research process that you enjoy. And it doesn't have to be aspects that most people would agree with are fun or are important even. But if there's some aspect of the process that you really enjoy, let that be your strength and it's going to aid you. I have colleagues, for example, who really like to read and read and read about the research problem that they want to study. And I say, just conduct your study for God's sake. Uh, but they want to collect as much background information. And they shouldn't become more like me. They should embrace that part of the process because maybe they're trying to read at a depth where they can really grasp the issue, and they're going to have a lot better foundation than I do when I start my project because they're going to emphasize what they enjoy. So maybe reflect on what aspects of the research process you enjoy, or even what aspect of teaching maybe that you enjoy, and try to find ways to link that joy to whatever problem you're trying to solve or research question you're trying to ask. All right, hopefully this next slide is a little more appropriate. All right, this is a classic one. Research, if you have the courage to do it well, is going to challenge your assumptions. Here's a big one for me from my own experience. I genuinely believed for the first 10 years as a college professor that the best way to teach someone was to not teach them. In other words, I was convinced that teaching was ineffective, that there was nothing a teacher could do to facilitate a learning objective that was better than a student's commitment on their own to learn said objective. So, what I tried to do was create conditions for students to take those learning objectives on as their own learning objectives and then let them go for it. So I was more interested in things like empathy and trust and encouragement and positive thinking. In other words, I tried to build relationships with students and then invite them to ask difficult questions and solve those, answer those questions, solve those problems. And I collected a lot of data, but I was afraid to really test my assumptions. Once I started testing my assumptions and looking at the data as objectively as I could, I had to let that assumption go. What I actually did was I suspended that assumption and tested a different approach to see if I could affect learning in students. And with the earlier story I told, I did. I feel like I created a classroom series of activities that helped them develop a learning objective, achieve a learning objective that they didn't have at the beginning. So if the only way for students to learn is for them to learn on their own, is the hypothesis, then I disproved it by teaching them something. Now, it was very hard to let that assumption go, even to assess the alternative possibility, um, because that would mean admitting that I was wrong for a long time and I perhaps did a huge disservice to my students in that time. Now, I was doing the best that I thought I could, but I wish I had been more courageous earlier in my career in testing those assumptions. So, and I'm sure there are a lot more assumptions I have about the learning process and about facilitating a learning environment and supporting colleagues, for example, being an administrator and leader at my school. I have assumptions that are holding me back, that are holding others around me back. And I hold on to them very tightly because to do otherwise is to admit that I'm wrong or I have room to learn. But I'm learning to do that. And so I think the more I can do that, the more I can challenge my assumptions, the better teacher I can be, the better leader I can be, the better researcher I can be. And as I say researcher, I'm realizing that I have assumptions in my research process as well that are holding me back and limiting the impact of my scholarship. So be willing to challenge your assumptions. It will make you a better teacher. Okay, if you can find an aspect of the process that you love or link something that you love to the process, if you have the courage to challenge your assumptions about what works and what doesn't, about what good teachers ought to do and what bad teachers ought not to do. So these are all assumptions. If you can challenge those and say, what if I'm wrong? Or what if there's a better way? And you actually conduct research, you test these assumptions. What you can do through the process is improve the whole practice. So my very basic philosophy of teaching was challenged this last year. And consequentially, my role in the classroom, the way I designed activities, the way I understand student goals, everything has changed. And I think it has changed for the better. I'll need to be careful not to become obsessed and compulsive about these new changes and therefore ignore new assumptions that I develop. But if you go through this process, you're going to find that every semester, even though, or every year, if you're a teacher, you're going to identify aspects of your teaching or your leadership or whatever it is you're focused on that can be improved or that are in need of improvement and ways to improve it. And so if you can let go of the egotism of always being right, like let that go and challenge yourself to improve, you're going to make incremental improvements and it's going to seem like tiny baby steps in the meantime. But 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, 10 years down the road, you're going to improve exponentially because each of those improvements are going to start to compound with each other. And what seems impossible today is probable in 10 years' time if you've been committed to this process of understanding what's happening, uh, having the courage to challenge your assumptions and test them, and then implement changes and see if improvements occur over a lifetime or over a career or even over a short period. um, your quality of teaching is going to improve. But what I think is more important for me, and perhaps you too, you'll enjoy the process more. So I forget if I include this somewhere in the series of talks, but motivation psychology has demonstrated repeatedly that when we commit ourselves to improving a skill, no matter what that skill is, and when I say commit ourselves, I mean work at it in a dedicated, systematic way. When we do this for any skill, we begin to enjoy that skill more. It's the phenomenon of competence. When we work at something and see improvement, whether it's playing the piano or learning how to ride on an exercise bike or a treadmill, or learning how to empathize with students, or learning how to teach algebra or do logic or learn a new language, when we commit ourselves to it, we begin to enjoy that process more and we want to make time for it and we view it as intrinsically motivated. So if you conduct classroom research, you will, and you're committed to it, you do so in a serious, earnest way, you're going to find increasingly that you love teaching more and more and view it as a calling. So I recommend this for anyone who doesn't feel connected to the profession anymore. Give it 6 months and really commit yourself to finding one aspect of it, maybe an aspect that you hate, and then try to understand it more, conduct or test your assumptions, conduct some research. I guarantee you that if you are committed to the process, and you're systematic about how you do it and make time for it every week, you're going to find that you've liked that part you hate. So I don't think I included that in the slides. Nope, that's the end of the slides. So I could add a number 4. You'll find greater fulfillment in your work.